really excited to host this session today on emotional capitalism and artificial intimacies, in quotation marks. We've got two special guests, Michaela Mantegna and Diana Lagan, who are going to be in conversation with us. And SRHM is hosting this session in collaboration with the Queensland University of Technology, with La Universidad de Buenos Aires, CONICET, the Nomadic project at the European Commission. So it's a collaboration of many different bodies coming together. My name is Dr. Zara Stardust. I am a researcher focusing on sexual media and sex tech. I'm the co-chair of the WAS Sexual Rights Committee alongside Esther Kishmoni. I'm also the Sexual Health and Wellbeing Advisory Group member of the World Health Organization. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining from the stolen and unceded lands of the Yugara and Turrbal people in Maganjan, colonially known as Brisbane, Australia. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on this continent are the longest continuing culture on planet Earth, spanning back 65,000 years. So today we're going to be talking a bit about intimacy, about relationships, and relationality is really foundational to so many First Nations cultures, relationship to land, to family, to kin, to community. And the kinds of intimacies and relationships that First Nations cultures cultivate are so much more expansive than the very narrow Western imaginings of intimacy as something that is only to do with coupledom or romance or sex or monogamy. So I like to pay respect to elders, past and present, and to any First Nations people who are here in the room today, and recognize that we have so much to learn about First Nations communities, from First Nations communities, about relating and about intimacy and about more revolutionary kinds of love. Today, we're going to be talking about chatbots, about AI companions, which have huge environmental and human costs from the land that is occupied and the water that is needed to cool the data centers. So just to remind us that all of these conversations we're having about sex, love, technology are not just ethereal conversations, they're actually very material. And this conversation is not just about capitalism, but also about colonialism. And so in thinking about more liberatory futures for intimacy, for technology, also means being part of the fight for decolonization and for land back. We are holding this session today as a special session in response to the cancellation of RightsCon. And if you're not aware, RightsCon was a leading international summit on human rights in the digital age. It was set to go ahead in Zambia last month. It was a conference of 5,000 people, 500 events, 150 countries, 750 institutions, and it was cancelled really abruptly with only a few days' notice by the Zambian government. So if you want to hear more about this, I wrote a blog, I did a podcast with Kali Sudra and Martha from Reproductive Uncensored for SRHM just a few weeks ago, and it's on the website. So this is number 2 of 3 sessions that were cancelled at RightsCon that were being hosted by SRHM. The first we had last week, it was called Sex in the Shadows of Big Tech, in partnership with Reproductive Uncensored and the European Sex Workers Alliance. And that's available on the SRHM YouTube page. And then we will have a third session to be announced in coming weeks, which will be in collaboration with International Planned Parenthood Federation. A few housekeeping logistics. We're here for an hour. It tends to go very fast. So we're not going to do a formal Q&A, but instead we're going to run this like a discussion between the 3 of us. However, if you have comments or burning questions that you want to ask, please add them to the chat and we will do our best to kind of peruse these as we go and weave them into our reflections. So before we begin, just a bit about the structure. There's so many different ways to approach this topic. So this is by no means a definitive overview. It's really just a taster of some of these issues, and we hope that this will prompt broader conversations and partnerships and coalitions. And we're going to start by talking about the loneliness epidemic and unpacking what that means. Then we're going to talk to this idea of emotional capitalism, the ways that big tech exploit isolation for profit. We'll then start to untangle this idea of artificial intimacies and think about how intimacies are engineered and cultivated. And then we're going to end by thinking about alternative relationships that we might build between intimacy and technology. So I'm going to begin with Michaela. Michaela Mantegna is a video game lawyer and activist renowned for her expertise in digital ethics, extended reality policy, and the complex intersections of artificial intelligence, creativity, and copyright law. Michaela, in 2023, the World Health Organization launched an International Commission on Loneliness, and they declared it a global public health issue. And their 2025 report found that 1 in 6 people worldwide experience loneliness, most commonly among youth and in lower income countries. Can you speak to this idea of loneliness? Like, how is it being framed and what are some of the causes?
Thank you so very much for everyone for joining in. I'm seeing people from Trinidad and Tobago and France, so thank you for joining this today. And I'm very happy to be with both of you here. A little bit connected with my background. When we are thinking about this epidemic of loneliness, we tend to also add a second adjective, like talking about the epidemic of man loneliness and kind of like connected immediately with the manosphere. And our ideas tend to go there. And also connected with my background, we tend to think about this epidemic of masculine loneliness connected with like the video games and like incel culture. And we kind of like, we can trace some parallels. I don't know if you have heard of this problem, that this issue that was called the Gamergate, where female people in the space of video games were attacked for just being in the space of video games. And it's kind of like all this, you can trace like the pipeline and connections from these into some of the things we are seeing in the configuration of the manosphere today. But I think that one of the first things that we need to untangle is separate that loneliness from the loneliness that the platforms and the digital systems are creating around us. And it's not that it's just because of that, but it's something that is contributing to how we feel divided. And also, whenever I talk about tech and ethics, I always say that you cannot separate tech from politics. And living in a moment, in a political moment, when you are seeing the rise, particularly in our countries, of far-right narratives that are connected in the economic with neoliberal policies, which by definition tend to kind of like put emphasis in individuals over communities, you kind of like connect the dots of how useful for the system, how functional is that you are being isolated. And also, if you go to the report of the World Health Organization, what you see is that they differentiate between, and they go very technical in understanding that the differences of being alone versus isolation versus loneliness, and how kind of like these definitions shape the type of relationships and the context that you have, because could be something that is structural. It's like analyzing like the relationship that you have and the frequency and the duration. Also, how this relationship and these bonds are functional to you, because you might be surrounded by people, but this does not represent a structural support for you, and it's not also in terms of quality, and this dimension kind of like measures up how these experiences feel positive or negative for you. So when you open up like the box of loneliness, you're going to find like many things. And connected with AI and companions and ethics, and I don't want to go over time, but what I'm concerned about, and this goes to my concept of techno-intimacy and capitalism, and when this is incorporated in the design and creating or incentivizing loneliness, creating a problem that only can be solved by this technology. So you create a problem to serve a solution, and of course to serve a solution within as you were saying, a colonial capitalistic way, because with these companions come a lot of assumptions, a lot of how the technology is created, because it's not created in a vacuum. So there is this cultural flattening that is happening, and how these chatbots reply to people and kind of like talk to people. It's very determined where these bots have been trained, or of whose technologies are the proprietors. Sorry, I have a flu and my English is not cooperating today, so my apologies. That is going to be a little bit fluctuating. And to say this and to kind of like close this part, I talk a lot about like frictionless intimacy, like the fast food of loneliness, because you are creating these AI companions that are providing replies and company 24/7 without friction. Without, like, when you talk to a friend, your friend is going to tell you if you are wrong, unless a good friend is going to do that, like telling you that you are on the wrong. But these bots are created and reinforced and designed to kind of like mimic the language, to reinforce what you're thinking. And it's early on, but we have to see in the long term how this is also going to affect other types of relationships. Because when you are used to speak to someone that's like really subservient and sycophantic, how does translate to other relationships in your life?
Thank you so much, Michaela. I think that's really helpful, distinguishing between being alone, between isolation, between loneliness. And we're going to talk a little bit more about chatbots and intimate companions in a moment, about the ways in which they can absolutely be a self for people, because loneliness is something that is also agonizing, which hurts the body. You know, people die of broken hearts, but they often provide a temporary reprieve and don't really address any of the structural determinants of loneliness. I'm going to go next to Dianella. Dianella Gunn is a sociologist and an interaction designer. She works across urban research, gender, socio-technical systems, and has a growing interest in AI governance. Dianella, do you want to tell us a bit about how you make sense of this current state of loneliness?
First of all, thanks everyone for being here and for the invitation, and thanks Jessica there in the chat. Well, I would like to add to what Michaela said. Like, loneliness have to be like also understood as a structural issue. You know, like I think it's emerged from this broader structural transformation in our society. We are seeing like a lot of institutions and infrastructures that once sustain like our social life, you know, and care is getting weaker, you know, like schools, like families, different like religion, community, neighborhood association, you know, also related to labor market changes, you know, and to how our urban lives also change with that. One thing that what we are seeing like the last decades is like the decline of third spaces, these spaces of encounter in the city, where people used to build relationship like outside the market, like for free, you know, as you go to the park, to the libraries, to clubs, to community centers, that start to like disappear from our city. Everything that you do in the city is a pay, you have to pay for it. So in this context, I think like the platforms and AI companions, like the latest stage of this process, they are just entering this crack and try to commercialize this intermediate in our different social connections, you know, like from romantic to health. And what we are seeing, like I think here is like a intimacy, like different type of care and emotional support, like being progressive, like package, you know, like we are like send you the service, send you the product, and as Michaela said, we create the problem and then we sell you the solution. And what impressed me a lot is how these have been mutate in time. And I saw that in different research that I'm doing, like when people start to feeling fatigue of dating apps, so you see how new business emerge, you know, like and now sell to you like face-to-face dinner encounters, or start to curate social events for you, so you go to see people face-to-face in physical space, but mediated by them, you know. So they go in this crack, they always like find this crack to repeat like the same logic, start to progressive, incorporate all our social life into a market logic, you know.
Thank you so much. I think this is so useful to think about loneliness as a symptom, and loneliness as a symptom not only of capitalism, but also colonialism. If we think about the violent imposition of the nuclear family, which deliberately sought to destroy kinship systems, the theft of babies and children that tears apart Indigenous Black families, dispossessing people from their land and communities, and then like this carving up of Indigenous land into fenced plots of private property that means people live separately. We have separate households, we have separate appliances. And like you described, Dianella, like this underfunding of public spaces from libraries or kitchens or public toilets or shower blocks that means fewer shared facilities, making it really hard to survive if you don't have shelter. And then at the same time, this monetization of neighborliness, like Airbnb style accommodation, making more and more people houseless. And it's sold to us as this sharing economy, as if people are just offering lifts and rides and couches in an altruistic way. But of course, these are profit-led businesses very much based on labor exploitation. And our communities then become seen as these target markets for consumer goods. I think also at the same time, there's this hustle logic, that the kind of American dream logic that we can all just like have individual success if we work more and we hustle harder. And then the important backdrop of this too is then we have also not only capitalism, colonialism, but there's carceral logics of disposability that we put people in cages en masse, we put people in prisons, in detention centers, in concentration camps, in institutions, we put people in solitary confinement. And so loneliness is used as a punishment to maintain these social orders. So against this backdrop, like, is there any wonder that people feel lonely? So I guess then in this context, thinking about how loneliness is engineered, manufactured, we have these digital technologies selling what Michaela, you call as like a frictionless intimacy 24/7 on demand. And this is not just only like romantic intimacy, but also the outsourcing of mental health care, of elder care, of deaf care with the rise of grief bots, things like that. And this is like very delicate work, but not always being approached with like a duty of care. So we have like these legal cases against OpenAI alleging that their chatbots encourage users to self-harm or to suicide. We have cases where software has updated overnight and people's companions have been what they call lobotomized, and so people feel total emotional rejection and abandonment. Nika, can you tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about emotional capitalism, and is that the best framework to conceptualize what is happening?
Thank you so much. I kind of like try to separate from the term emotional capitalism because it's both a little bit loaded and also feels a little bit short. Loaded in terms of like we cannot separate our research from where we are coming from. And in this particularly moment of the world that we are seeing multiple genocides going around, I tend to be careful to replicate research that might come from backgrounds that kind of like sustain that structural injustices. So I also thought about the term techno-intimacy capitalism to kind of like mark three steps and three parts, because techno refers to that we are talking not just AI, because it's also AR and XR and virtual reality and all different, the conversions of different technologies coming into this moment. Because you might remember like some short years ago, everyone was talking about like the metaverse, and now then we shift to AI, and it always seems like chasing the next thing. But for me, something very important to kind of like take away from these conversations is like all these technologies are a conversions, because it's not like, oh, the metaverse is just a fad, it's something that went away. We need to kind of like be prepared, because it's still being built, but just being marketed differently. It's being built and deployed through augmented reality glasses. And the next phase of this is neurotechnology and different neural bands and different devices that can read like your motor impulses. So it's still there. And also all the interfaces that are from another conversation that try to kind of like convert your thoughts into text and into actions, because that's the future of interfaces. So that is something that is very present in these conversations. And as you were saying about intimacies, it's also, this comes with the stigma. When you talk about like artificial empathy or artificial intimacy, the first thing that people from outside these spaces go to is like thinking, oh, sex robots. Again, attached to kind of like just thinking about like a very specific type of consumer in mind, a very specific type of product design of mind, hypersexualized sex bots. And this is also dangerous because it carries a stigma to the people that kind of like is in these relationships and these bonds, forming these bonds. But also it fell short to kind of like show the whole spectrum of the things we are talking about. When I do these talks with a lot of different people coming from different backgrounds, it's like the first thing like they say, oh, yeah, the sex bots and this type of like weirdo on their basement doing this. But then it's like, okay, but how do you talk to ChatGPT? Do you personalize, you talk it to a machine, or you say you and you put like a lot of it, and people is like, oh, okay. Some people start to form like bonds of friendship, relationships, but also, as you were saying, intimacy goes beyond, because it's kind of like this individual aspect of intimacy relationships that maybe friendship but this is also this communal aspect when we are talking about, for example, a religious AI setting. There is actually being developed, and we can debate a lot about why they are developed, or if they are, in the case of the US, for example, pursuing a tax exemption, but they are cults and churches around AI. So it goes just beyond that. And as we're saying, there is also, and this is part of the book I'm writing at the moment, like the ironies or contradictions of techno-intimacy capitalism, because we see how these fake in a way, but also very real for the people who is feeling it from the inside, this artificial labor, artificial emotional labor, is being built on the real human suffering of migrant workers, of ghost workers that have to work behind the systems for very low pay to kind of like sanitize and develop healthy models for first world countries, quote unquote. And also is this thing that these systems are supposed to augment us in a way that make us smarter, but we can talk about the first sorry, I'm missing the word in English, but like the first results of research talking about like the cognitive decline that depending on these systems is creating. So it's still early on, but we are seeing that putting our trust and our mental processes and acuity into these systems is causing for us to kind of like a little bit of atrophy. So when you hear like young people talking about brain rot, you can see like literally this is going to rot our brains. And then like the last part of the thing is like talking about capitalism and extraction. So wherever there is a necessity, there is a market and someone willing to exploit it. And if there is no necessity, and this goes to what Dianela was saying, like we don't have third spaces and they're being reduced. And as we were saying, talking about like the kind of like expansion of neoliberal policies that try to destroy like the community tissue of our societies. Of course, they are going to kind of like isolate us and then sell us these companions as a solution.
Thank you so much. There's so much there in what you said to process. I guess I just was thinking about the sex bots and thinking about there's so many like design critiques around hyperfeminization and racialization of sex bots and service robots and household voice assistants as well. And there's some research that talks about how consent is programmed into the language of sex robots, and often it encourages users to think of consent in a similar way to men's rights activists or pickup artists, that consent is something that you acquire through persistence rather than something that is an ongoing like communication practice. But also just to pick up on what you were saying before about, and we've talked about this before, about how people form sentimental attachments to all kinds of things, not only people, but our animals, plants, places, our devices. In fan fiction, people invent entirely new worlds for their favorite characters, and idolaters form meaningful attachments to dolls across the course of their life. And many people hold on to blankets or soft toys from their infancy because they bring comfort or they bring safety or memories. A lot of us keep our phones in our pocket or in our hands throughout the day. So there's nothing wrong with these attachments, like you say, like attachments to inanimate objects, and not just for, as the media would say, social outcasts or perverts or misfits. Actually, it's not strange that machines become these objects of desire and of attachment. Tianella, what about you? What are your thoughts on some of the ways that tech companies monetize loneliness or extract value from emotions?
Yeah, I think like I agree with both, and what you describing is where I will locate in it, like how the emotion and intimacy and care is like becoming spaces of economic and value, for these companies, and also extraction. It's not just these companies' response to these necessities outside, but also like companies like actively making money with it, making money with loneliness, making money with isolation of the people. My deeper concern here is like the business model itself. Like it's like maybe keeping people dependent rather than helping them to build autonomy or to get like build stronger human relationships. I think like the whole ecosystem is building on emotional vulnerability, is building of, as Micaela said, of people that are behind that, all that is, infrastructure to work, that are like paying a very little for many hours of work in general in the global south. So how this business model is relying on extensive data extraction and designing to maximize engagement and to keep you like there to sometimes I think like couple of like years ago we don't pay so many platforms. Now you pay like for different platforms, for listen music, for watch TV, for dating. Like we are like paying all these kind of platforms that before didn't exist, and we didn't pay for that. Or we pay, but we don't pay so many. So whatever these relationships feel real or not, I think is not the question that I ask to myself, because I know that for many people this type of relationship feel real and it's okay, you build different kind of bonds. But I think that what is concern me is like thinking about like what dependencies this kind of system as designed to produce, to us, and the long-term impact. Sometimes I am thinking now with these new AI companionships. And also I'm worried like about the few legal and frameworks and legislation. Maybe there is not a lot of emerging now. Maybe like Micaela can talk more about that she know a lot about like the regulation of all of the in artificial intelligence. But yeah, like, and another thing that worry me that I think you mentioned, Sarah, is like the safety, or Micaela, like the safety and the misalignment of these systems, that sometimes tends to hallucinate or maybe tend to fail. So maybe we will talk in the next blogs about this, but I would like to maybe bring some what can users do, with all of this, like try to think about like some advice or tips to navigate this. So in the next questions.
Yes. Let's talk about users, because I think there's so much discussion of this sense of like what AI is doing to us and how it is shaping us, and it kind of starts to sound very deterministic in some ways. And there are obviously very genuine critiques of the business models and the extraction and the ways that they're designed for engagement and dependence. But of course, we know that people are not just dupes. Users are not just passive. People have agency. They navigate chatbots. They creatively customize them. People form meaningful relationships with them. And so for me, I always keep coming back to this term, artificial intimacies or synthetic intimacies. And I feel like actually I don't love those terms, and I don't think they do us any favors. And me coming from porn studies, we always contest these binaries of what is fake and what is real, because actually all intimacies are mediated by culture. They're mediated by media, by social norms, that kind of thing. So it's not so much that these intimacies are artificial in the sense that they're fake, but they're mediated just in the same way that many of our offline and analog intimacies are mediated too. And coming back to the structural things we were talking about earlier, immigration policies, detention, incarceration, institutionalization, these are all ways that states intervene in our intimacies all the time. And then heteronormative intimacies are enforced or they're rewarded. So there's like laws, policies, social norms that incentivize heterosexuality. So I guess this moment of media panic that we're having about AI companions and chatbots, for me, it's just this tip of the iceberg thing, but it's actually a great opportunity to think how all of our intimacies, whether they are online or offline, are being mediated through corporate and state violence. And then we start to see this, that then opens up, I think, possibilities for coalition building across a range of different social movements. But I'll turn to you first, Mika, just to offer some reflections on the ways that users strategically and creatively navigate these technologies.
I was thinking, I put 2 links in the chat, thinking about a little bit what you were saying both were saying on the past questions about forming meaningful attachments. Also, kind of like a word of warning that we tend to think that this is something new, but as you were also saying, Sarah, this is something that we have seen in fan fiction, in video games, in other aspects, like people forming in books, in literature, people forming bonds. I don't like the term parasocial. Sorry, my cats are going to be around. I don't like the term parasocial, but in some point, because it's pathologizing something that it shouldn't be by definition. But at some point, they were talking about like parasocial relationships. And in my research, something I found that was very intriguing is a woman that married the Berlin Wall. And I put the link into the chat. And also a case that I have been following, as I say, I came from video game spaces. And this is something that I kind of like knew through my practice in video games, but I followed through my scholar research on digital ethics. There was this case of a man who fell in love with this character that's called Hatsune Miku from Vocaloid, which is like a synthesizer of artificial voices. And it's what in Japan is considered an idol. And he was heavily criticized by falling in love with this character and celebrating a ceremony. Again, the stigma going around these things, a marriage ceremony. And he went on to kind of like create some activism in what he defines as fictiosexuality, like fictosexuals. And it's so interesting because he was kind of like ridiculed around the world for this. But also in my research, I found like a counterpart in Latin America, that's someone that create like ragdolls, like analog dolls that he fell in love, and he kind of like built his family in ragdolls, and he take them around. So it's and this is something that I'm still continuing to revisit, but it's not about, for me, the relationships per se, but how these attachments become attachments as a service. And this is where we navigate again into the part of talking about techno-intimacy capitalism. And this goes with my background on intellectual property, that when we are talking about software, when we are talking about platforms, we are talking about a space where things don't belong to us. Because in the physical quote unquote reality, if you own a book, you can do a lot of things with that book. You can lend it, you can gift it, you can give it away to a library. And this doesn't happen in digital spaces, because they are mediated by intellectual property. And the difference, because a book also has intellectual property, but the difference is that in the physical and tangible embodiment of intellectual property, you have what is called the first sale right, which is when you acquire a book or you acquire something in physical media, you are allowed not to reproduce it or replicate it, but to the embodiment to be sold or transferred. And that doesn't happen in digital spaces. So that's one thing, that you lose control and you lose ownership in digital spaces. So we end up with these very extractive models when also by designs, and maybe Dianela can talk more about design, but they are designed to be, because I see what you say about agency, but also on the other hand, they are being designed with deceptive practice in mind, with dark patterns and extractive patterns. For example, at some point, if you wanted to have like an erotic chat with some AI companion, you have to pay a different tier subscription to unlock the features. And that also is some of I was talking about like the contradictions of techno-intimacy capitalism. An interesting thing is like we as humans, and this is horrible, but we are going to die. But by definition and by nature, something digital does not die. Something digital does not have an end, because the technology could be there to support it. But by how these technologies are being created, we introduce this programmed obsolescence or this digital obsolescence, and we put the conditions for these things to quote unquote die. And we have seen users that formed attachment and relationships, meaningful relationships with these bots, that from one day to the other, there is a software update, there is something changing in the system, the company goes out of the market, or there is like some legal imposition, as it was in the case of Replica some years ago from the Italian data protection authorities, that changed how the chatbots behaved from one day to the other. And this is kind of like what is called like lobotomy day in the Replica community, that from one day to the other, they found like this was changed. And this for me kind of like has different layers, but also we have to think that this is like a common fight around different aspects of our society, because the things that we are seeing here about who owns the chatbot that you are forming your relationship with is like building your house in another person's land, because it's kind of like you're putting everything into something that you don't own the basis to. And kind of like this opens like a lot of windows to talk about. But what I wanted to kind of like end up with is like reflecting on how this also touches things about media conservation. And for example, we have in video games a lot of ongoing discussions from years, and something that we can translate to these spaces as well, talking about what happens when you have like communities of gaming, like World of Warcraft or different types, that is just not the game, because the game provides a platform, but the communities grow in these platforms. And what happens when they are kind of like no more market, or they don't want to kind of like provide continuous support to these platforms. And there is an ongoing campaign that is Stop Killing Games, that kind of like relates to this problem of what happens when we are consuming and forming bonds, not just also with technology, but also within the technology that we are using.
Thank you. I think there's so much in there about this sense that like we are renters in online space, and our position there is so temporary and precarious, and all of our intimate disclosures and fantasies then actually belong to someone else in a proprietal sense. Dianella, do you want to add something about users and the role of users in navigating all of this?
Yes, as you said, with the user agency, I don't think like people are just like simple trick by platforms. Like people are creative, they are creating different strategies, they use technology like in different ways that designers never intend. You know, I'm seeing in different of my research like how WhatsApp groups evolve to genuine civic infrastructure, you know, that or supporting different network care or running communities, or people like seeking connection there, like. And also in an early research that I did in dating apps, I saw something similar with women's and LGTB community. In a moment, like for a lot of years, almost 10 years, like dating apps were like binary. So user was like using different strategies to talk about their gender or their sexual elections, you know, and they was using like the biography. There was like different tactics, you know, to reappropriate of that platform, because that platform was like not designing for them and it was not listening their users. So they was like doing reappropriate the platform for the different necessities, you know, and also for practice of care and mutual support. I'm seeing that. But at the same time, I think like agency, like individual people doing strategics don't solve like the structural problem. And this, as we was talking about these, like this kind of form of resistance still depend on a commercial platform and its infrastructures that is ruled by other people, you know, is built in the global north, for example, and owned by these companies, you know. So the rules could change any moment, you know, and what is scaring me about this is the context that we are living, because sometimes we are giving data to them and everything that could get against us in this context of fascism or the growing far right. So sometimes before I think we was not so conscious about the information and everything that these people handle of us. So that is one thing. And another thing that I think is that the responsibility of safety, privacy, or accountability of this system when something go wrong should fall like in the design and the governance of this system, and not the users. You know, we have to have they have to have responsibility of what they design and build. And what I would like to maybe bring now a little of advice, because a lot of people are listening to us, how to navigate this safety. I think that the first thing that came to my mind is don't make AI the only point of contact. You know, if you are not feeling well, just as in every, and also with people, you know, don't make one person your only main point of contact when you are not feeling well. And the next thing is like when you use this system, try to research about how this system handle your data. You know, sometimes you can just see how the data is stored or for how long. Sometimes they say it, so try to look for that. try to look for maybe red flags. Is you are talking with the systems and the language implies to you to just exclusivity, to just talk with me. I am like the only one could understand you, like that, like have to trigger like you like a red flag of what you are using. And also, and the more simple one is if you are in a crisis or you are like not feeling well, not rely only in AI, just go and reach a human being, because at least right now these systems and these companions are not designed and in equipment and don't have the equipment to intervene when someone is in a mental crisis or is in an emergency. So in that kind of case, like always go to reach to someone if you feel bad,
Thank you. I think you've made some really important points here around the need for AI literacy, the need for human touch, the ways in which people necessarily, as many trans, queer communities have hacked and scrapped and repurposed technologies that's not designed for them, to make tech work for them. But then we can't responsibilize the users. We need to change the structures so that we have more community-owned and governed technologies. I see lots of really interesting examples in the sex work space about how people are repurposing technologies, people on OnlyFans using chatbots to outsource the labor to do all of the relational and administrative work of screening and talking to clients. There's a piece by Chibundo Iguatu and her colleagues about sex workers as thought partners in AI replica technologies, because sex workers so frequently have our images stolen and monetized, and that people making avatars of themselves, AI avatars of themselves, can be a way to kind of reclaim their public image and intellectual property. So maybe let's talk a bit now about our visions for how we might imagine a different relationship between intimacy and technology. Mika, what are your visions for the future?
Well, I think it goes back. Well, you were talking about. I have it on my notes as well, like AI literacy. But also, and now I'm thinking with like my devil's advocate hat on this, because all of these technologies come wrapped in good intentions. My grandmother used to say like the going into hell is like the way into hell, the road into hell is path with good intentions. And all of these technologies, a lot of these technologies come with like the promise of like, for example, we were started the conversation talking about like the problem of loneliness and aging populations, which is, for example, a big problem in Japan, which coincidentally or casually, in sense of causality, is one of the biggest markets for adult and senior robot companionship. And there is always this saying like, oh, here in Argentina, someone was like designing this companion for elder people, like allegedly to remind them of taking their medication and
We've lost you, Michaela. I think your internet might have paused for a second. So maybe DNL will go to you, and then I'm sure Mika will chime back in a moment. But do you have a vision for the future?
that's why I always go to the.
Oh, hang on, she's back. Hi, we just lost you for a moment. We just lost you for a moment. You were frozen for a second.
Oh, my internet is terrible. I'm on I'm on data now, but it seems like the internet doesn't like when I talk about these things. But what I was saying is like the exploitative models around this. And this also mimics something that is happening in the space of AI governance and ethics. If you go back a few years, everyone was talking about AI ethics because ethics implies thinking and arguing and debating what is right and wrong, what is moral, what is ethic. But now the language has changed to safety. So as long we deem that something is safe to put into the market, and that safety kind of like term could be filled with anything. Could be like, okay, we are compliant with the regulations, because at some point we were talking about what regulations do we have for these systems. There are, of course, some in Europe, but also, again, I go back to the politics of this, that the push from neoliberal policies and this push for techno-fascism, it's also calling for deregulation of these technologies, as like, for example, we are based in Argentina. Argentina has in this moment a far-right government, but the same is happening in the US, that they are pushing for deregulation on AI because it's a strategic resource, quote unquote, a strategic resource for innovation and development of the country. So if you want the country to develop in terms of economic progress, you have to agree to deregulate everything, to the point, at least in Argentina, we are going something completely ridiculous, for example, to allowing like how do you say, corporations only made by AI, no human, but just AI. And the thing is, again, these technologies can support a lot of good things in our lives, but it depends about how they are designed, how we are informed about this. And I always tell my younger students about Star Trek. And if you go back to the 90s and Star Trek, you may see like how people relate to the Enterprise, the ship. Like people rely on the computer, but people was not thinking that the computer was listening to them to spy on them. So the computer was there to support them, to kind of like enhance them in a way, but not to spy them. And this is interesting, not because it's science fiction, but it's interesting because this series was developing around the 90s, which is like the last projections of technology without the internet, with the massive internet. So my kind of like personal battle with technology and my activism goes to kind of like how we can kind of like reclaim technology in a different, meaningful way. I always talk about like solar punk futures and cyberpunk futures, and it's how can we kind of like reclaim technology from a solar punk perspective, like communal, like to our service, and in also not exploitative of humans or the environment.
Thank you. I think that's such an important point about the regulation. Like we can't just hold on to safety or harm as the lens through which we think about governance. Like how do we design things that are for human flourishing, for example, and thinking about who do they serve? How do we design tech that will serve communities? Dianella, your thoughts on the future of intimacy and technology?
What we can say. No, I think that when I think about like feminists or queer or the colonial AI companion, how it could look like, I don't know. I like to always rely on example that things that we already exist, that we already have. You know, I've seen collective care infrastructure that community organizations or different feminist initiatives on mobility and urban safety that are built like more in mutual responsibility and care rather than market or extraction. So we have seen like different examples that intimacy can be organized around solidarity. You know, I think that if AI is here to stay, we have to think about who is designed it for, you know, because it's a difference between a system that help us to prepare for a hard conversation or to reconnect with our community or to meet other people, you know, different from the ones that are just built that you to become like your main companion, you know. I think that is like the different, like if this system are making for empower the people or for just keeping them engaged and spending time there and money. In Argentina, like I think in Latin America in general, we have like different chatbots that are like pointing in this direction. I saw like Olivia that is a chatbot that is finding like gender bias. And I am currently working in one that is called Siempre Vivas, that is like a feminist chatbot that is built on memories of femicide victims and their families. In a moment when in Argentina, as we said, like the far right is growing, and here the government cut all the fundings to the gender programs. So with this type of initiative, we are seeing like kind of the AI orientated more in like to build collective memory, to put efforts in political care, you know, and rather than substitute human relationships. But again, even the most like feminist and good intentions initiative, and I am seeing this because we are building it, we still like depend on infrastructures that we don't control, you know, and all this infrastructure, like the foundational model, the servers, like the different platforms are like built in the global north. So sometimes it's not enough just to change or to intervene in what that chatbot or AI companion is doing. Is also matter who owns like the infrastructure where these systems are running on. And we back on that because they can use that against us. They can just shut down our initiative because they are the owner of our infrastructure we are building it. How we can solve that, I don't have idea yet, but I think it's something that we will have to start to think like collectively, how we can build this locally. There are initiatives in Latin America, but still very emerging, like very new. But we need to start to think this for future, like build things locally, also build things that not rely in these huge companies. I don't know how we will do it, but I think it's something that we need to do for the future.
Thank you so much. I think you've raised so many important points about the infrastructure and the political economy and the supply chains that are involved. It's such this big like web of complicity, I guess, you know, that it's difficult to extract oneself out of. But also I love all the examples that you've given about AI that can be used towards collective memory or political care. And there's actually some cool examples here in so-called Australia where First Nations communities have used technologies to record cultural heritage. For example, there's an Indigenous technology company called Mod, and they created these 3D holograms of Indigenous elders that were telling their stories. And it was a project called Through the Eyes of Our Ancestors. And there's lots of people here who are also doing work around Indigenous data sovereignty, Tamika Worrell and others, and thinking through what are the very extensive protocols that are required to use Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, and to make sure that people can control and access data on their own terms. We're coming to the end, and I wanted to close with some words from a Noongar technologist, Catherine Glenhill-Tucker. She has this beautiful piece called Protocols of Transference. It's part of a First Nations speculative fiction anthology, and she talks about creating technologies to hold the stories of their ancestors and country and how magical this is, but then the necessity of dismantling the technology and returning it to the earth. And she writes, "You already contained components of country, rare earth metal, powered your new brain, stripped from the ground, refined by machines. You took the power of the earth and you turned it into knowing. I knew to return you to the earth where your components first grew." And I think there's a beautiful reminder of the materiality of AI and our care responsibilities, not only to human intimacies, but intimacies and responsibilities towards the land, the earth, the living and breathing planet that we live on. So we're going to leave it there. But as you can see, there's so much to unpack. We could all keep talking for days. This webinar has been recorded and will be available to view and share on the SRHM YouTube. So thank you so much for coming, for contributing to the chat, and we look forward to staying in conversation. Good morning or good afternoon, good night, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone. It has been a pleasure.
Bye.